So ever since Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince came out, there hasn't been much coverage on the game. And what's out there is mostly negative because people seem confused on what is Dragon Quest Monsters, right? I wanted to not review this game, but just go over on how this game is compared to modern Pokemon-like games, and also how it is compared to other Dragon Quest games, right? So first, let's go over the graphics, which is one of the main things that you could see is not that high budget compared to Dragon Quest games, you know, especially mainline Dragon Quest games. I would say it's mostly similar to those graphics in Dragon Quest Treasures. And honestly, Treasures might have slightly better graphics. But compared to modern Pokemon games, it is either the same or slightly better in terms of graphics, right? But better than those two games is Shin Megami 5, for example, a Pokemon-like game where those graphics and visuals are way better than Dragon Quest Monsters and Pokemon, right? But also, the other thing that people are talking about is the frame rate, because, you know, it's not the best compared to other Dragon Quest games or Pokemon-like games, right? I would say the frame rate is not the best. You know, there's times where frame rate drops, especially in the beginning areas, but the more you play, the better it gets, right? It's still not the best, but, you know, it's playable and it's not crazy like, let's say, Pokemon, right? Where in that game, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, that is, we all know that had many issues in terms of frame rate and glitches, right? Where at the most part, well, at least in the beginning, was unplayable, right? For most people. So it is definitely more of a budget Dragon Quest game, just like Dragon Quest Treasures. So that is good to know if you are interested in the game. Now, gameplay wise is the whole reason for these kinds of games, these kinds of Pokemon-like games, you know, Shin Megami, in terms of that, like the gameplay is what makes the game, right? So is because of the monster catching, the gameplay loop of capturing monsters, you know, capturing demons in Shin Megami, capturing Pokemon in Pokemon. So this is why people are really interested in these kinds of games, and they're honestly one of a kind in terms of a genre in the RPG world, right? Now, people that know me know how I feel about Pokemon in terms of gameplay. What I like about these, you know, kinds of games is the capturing aspect, right? The addictive of, you know, capturing Pokemon and monsters and demons and stuff like that. But the reason I'm not really fond on Pokemon, even though the Pokemon look really cool, is because Pokemon, the game, is really simplistic in terms of the combat, and there feels like no reason to grind the game, since it's just that easy that you could just simply, you know, get your starter Pokemon and take care of the whole game. Like, you don't really have to switch out your starter, because you don't really have trouble through the game to actually change up your Pokemon in terms of your main Pokemon. You could just, with your starter Pokemon, beat the whole game, right? So it makes it kind of where, yeah, I like capturing, but there's no point in capturing realistically if you could just beat the whole game with your starter Pokemon, you know? Now, in Dragon Quest Monsters, that's not the case. It has more going for it in terms of combat and mechanics in the game. It does not have evolution, you know, like in Pokemon, but you can actually fuse monsters basically like Shin Megami or Persona games. You can customize every monster you capture, not only the skills they use, but also the passive skills and more stuff like that, you know? Then you have the fuse mechanic, where you do fuse two monsters and adds more depth into the monster you create. So in terms of evolving, yeah, it does not have that, but fusing or synthesis or whatever the case, like in Shin Megami where you fuse the monsters, you know, in my opinion, it does add more depth into just evolving a monster, because you could fuse two monsters and get specific skills for that monster that you've just fused. So it makes it more in depth, in my opinion. Now, the combat itself is great. If you are familiar with mainline Dragon Quest games, it's basically the same thing, traditional turn-based, you know, but just with using monsters instead of using your, you know, human characters like the mainline Dragon Quest games. I would say the visuals in combat are not on par with the mainline Dragon Quest games, or I would say even Pokemon, you know, or it kind of similar like Pokemon, you know, a little simplistic in visuals when using skills and using attacks from your monster. But obviously, like I said, it's not a big budget game, so I wouldn't expect something like Dragon Quest Monsters look like Dragon Quest 11, for example, right? The world itself, it's not open world, but instead it's like open areas with some cool mechanics where, you know, the season changes and it spawns different kinds of monsters depending on the seasons. So that's pretty interesting inside the game, right? Now, for the story, it's not going to be the best story in a video game. It is a little bit more simplistic, but not to the point where there's no interest, right? Because it's pretty interesting, especially since it takes place in the timeline where Dragon Quest IV took place, where the hero from that game, Dragon Quest 4, takes place and is trying to save the world, and you're basically there in that timeline, right? So you get to see that hero actually, right? So it does have some unique aspects of, you know, the storytelling there, instead of just being the best monster catcher or whatever, you know. And this is where I mean where it adds more than your traditional Pokemon game, because instead of just doing gym battles, you know, there's an actual story where you need to actually use all your mechanics in the game, grind, you know, fuse, capture to beat these certain bosses compared to Pokemon, right? It basically gives a reason, this story basically gives a reason for you to grind and capture, and you can't just do it with your starter monsters, you know. Like, that's what I'm trying to explain here, where the reason that I'm more interested in this game is because of that reason, right? Where it makes you actually try to fuse, to use everything in the game in order to beat the game, you know. And finally, the last thing I want to mention about the game is the online features. You know, there is a competitive scene. I know nothing about the competitive scene, but apparently it is a big scene for the game. You know, it has your online battles, your ranked matches, friend matches, the multiplayer tournaments, which that sounds pretty interesting. It has quick fire contest, which basically it's matches where you can do automatically with a team that you have, and you get rewards daily, which I guess is pretty cool, right? And there's also an online shop where you can purchase items for your monsters, and it refreshes every day in real life time, right? So many options have been added in this game. I've never played a Dragon Quest Monsters game, so I don't know how many more options they added, but it sounds like they added quite a few options in terms of online and also the main story single player game, right? Because if you do beat the main story, there is still so much to do, whether you want to just rank up or play with friends or actually compete in the competitive scene, right? So at the end of the day, this game is more for Dragon Quest fans and also for people that want to try out a new Pokemon-like game. You know, it's not the best game out there, it's not the best Dragon Quest game out there as well, but it is a nice spin-off, and it has its own style, you know, its own place in the Dragon Quest series. And I see it as basically a mix of Pokemon and Shin Megami with, you know, the combat and mechanics, right? But what do you guys think about the game? Did you get the game? Are you curious to trying it out, or just waiting on a sale? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you next one. Later.